So can you tell me how the practice of yoga helps people with issues with chronic pain, with unresolved grief, difficult emotions? How does that help?
So I am sure that you've heard a lot that there's primary grief and there's secondary grief. And the primary grief is easily enough addressed in lots of areas of your life, and you're working through that. But the secondary grief kind of gets under your skin, or that conversation about going through something. You really just have to go through it. You can't stop in the middle of the dark tunnel. You have to keep going to get to the other side. But secondary grief can feel like those cold, dark walls are just closing in.
Mm-hmm.
And so the practices of yoga help us address some of the ways that we are holding things in our body, because our body keeps the score on everything. And so grief tends to bring up other grief. It tends to bring up secondary things that are also sad. As I
Could
mentioned,
you give an example?
yeah, as I mentioned, it was hard. It was hard to go through a divorce and all of the stuff that was like right there on the surface that needed to be worked through and talked about and thought about. But it was way harder to, again, step forward and just see my old house and the old life that I don't have anymore. Or, again, every time, the conversation comes up that normally it would be between like two married people, and now it's between two co-parents. And that's a secondary grief. Oh, I don't get that anymore.
Right.
And so that stuff tends to kind of keep you in certain states of, when's that going to come up again? I don't know when that's going to come up again. I don't know when I'm going to feel that again. And yoga is about awareness. The most essential thing that we can get out of yoga is awareness. And yoga therapists treat most often on a pantamaya kosha model. So that just means this 5-layer model that says we need to be aware of our body and how our body is holding these things, or how our body is bringing things up. Like, sadly enough, and nothing wrong with him, but sometimes a conversation with my ex could kind of tighten my shoulders and tighten my jaw.
Right.
And
I can relate to that kind of experience. Yes.
Yeah. And so that's my body keeping that there and saying, remember, this was sad, or you felt some things here. And then, you can jive underneath that. And then there's our mind, and what our thoughts are doing at that moment, and what our emotions are doing at that moment. And then there's our breath. Right? And so we're aware my breath is changing, even though my body's fine. And I used to go through kind of, some PTSD, and I would be perfectly fine in my body, but, my breath was different. My heart rate was different. It was still feeling some of that.
Right.
And then we can go under a layer, and yoga wants us to look at the Vinamaya question. It wants to look at the witness, the watcher of all this, and go, how is all this affecting me? How are these pieces coming together?
How do you think massage benefits someone who is grieving?
So I have been able to treat several people now that have gone through the grieving process, either with spouses or losing their parents, and walking through that with them. And it's been all over as far as timeline. Some of them are, unexpected. Some of them are a long time coming. So I've been able to kind of watch how that all plays out. But the couple points that I think are really important. One, when you're going to a massage therapy session, the therapist does not expect you to have on perfect makeup, wonderful hair, be dressed in a way that's maybe even appropriate for the grocery store. If you come in sweats and you can just barely get there, that's it. You just have to walk from your car into that studio. And so going through the grieving process, letting people know that it's okay to just show up. Sometimes it's hard to just get up and take a shower. And this is a fabulous appointment. This isn't going to the grocery store where you might run into somebody who maybe hasn't heard, or maybe doesn't know even what to say, because you get those kind of awkward situations where you can tell they're avoiding you or going out of their way a little too much. So for me, I like the idea of being able to go somewhere where there's not going to be this expectation. Your expectation is just to come. That's it.
Right.
Just show up.
Yeah.
I think everyone's grief journey is individualistic. What might work for me does not work for you. What might work for you does not work for me. I think that there's some commonalities, though.
Mm-hmm.
I think let's go. One of the things that is this idea of good emotions and bad emotions, for example, and feeling judgment about them. They're just emotions. And what I did very early on, and I think this was I talked about this, but I think it's really important. For me, what worked for me is I used my best defense mechanism initially for grief when I went into grief, after I lost my mom unexpectedly, is I tried to learn it and I tried to intellectualize grief. I tried my best defense, which is to intellectualize and use my mind. I went to all the research papers about the physiological of grief. I went through all of the anthropological sessions about grief. I went through looked at all the different religions and how they went through grief, and I thought that would make it better, and it didn't. The only thing that made it better was to feel it. And I made the conscious decision to feel everything and that meant I suffered, but I felt sadness and I felt anger and bitterness and resentment. And I felt just, part of my French, I felt pissed off, but I also opened myself to feel joy and happiness and camaraderie and friendship and gratitude. And I didn't feel them. I felt them all interchangeably. So I thought that in grief, I also would only feel I would only feel gray. But I realized that some days I feel dark gray. Some days I feel light gray. Some days I feel red. Some days I feel blue. Some days I don't feel anything at all. Some days I feel everything. I thought I had this idea of what grief was going to be, and what it ended up being was so much different than it was. But by feeling everything, I was able to experience the plethora of emotions, and I didn't lock myself out of the quote unquote good ones. I was able to feel everything, including joy in my grief, and including gratitude in my grief, and including friendship. And if I had said, I'm not going to feel anything, then I would not have felt joy and gratitude and friendship in the same way that wouldn't have felt anger and bitterness and despair.
And when you lose a person, you actually lose a lot of that as well. So it's something that I think we can relate to, even though the circumstances have been different. You lose who you thought you were going to be, the future you thought you were going to have, the routine you thought that that you were going to be engaged in. All of that gets disrupted. It may happen at different times and in different circumstances, but in that we can definitely relate to each other.
But when I did pray, I felt immediate peace, knowing that he was with my Heavenly Father and with Jesus Christ, and that he was at peace, and that I will see him again, and that he will have the opportunity for exaltation. I knew that, and I knew that he is a wonderful man.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Good Grief Believer podcast. I believe we grieve better when we share our experiences with others, and I am always eager to hear from other people about their unique grief journey. Please contact me if you would be willing to share your perspective with me as a guest on the Good Grief Believer podcast by emailing me at goodgriefbeliever@gmail.com. That's GOODGRIEFBELIEVER @gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you soon.